unbeatable because you have absolute security in that market because that war can't end.
Let's continue to unpack your description of what's happened.
What the war on terror is as a new economy with the Bush administration playing the role of venture capitalist, of deep-pocketed venture capitalist, that the way in which the war on terror has been defined is a war against evil everywhere forever, against an enemy that you can't talk to because all they want is your annihilation, so that you have to protect the homeland against any conceivable threat and respond to any possible threat abroad as if it's a 100% threat. Right. So this is, from a military perspective, unwinnable, but from an economic perspective, unbeatable because you have absolute security in that market because that war can't end.
Let's continue to unpack your description of what's happened after September 11th and kind of stay away from Iraq because you're describing other things that have happened. Yeah. We've already spent the first half of the show discussing Iraq. You say September 11th appeared to have provided Washington with the green light to stop asking countries if they wanted to have the U.S. version of free trade and democracy and to start imposing it with shock and awe military force. I mean, what other than Iraq and Afghanistan, are there other things that you're thinking about when you wrote that?
Well, I was referring specifically to Iraq, but in the book, I first used the phrase disaster capitalism after the Asian tsunami, when I went to Sri Lanka 6 months after the tsunami hit to research the reconstruction and actually to contrast it with Iraq, and I found some really disturbing parallels, which is that just to give you one example, 4 days after the tsunami hit, the government pushed through a water privatization law, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, Sri Lanka, first of all, before the tsunami, had elections, and the party that was proposing these sort of neoliberal reforms prescribed by the IMF and the World Bank, water privatization, electricity privatization, labor market flexibility, all of these code words, or they don't say privatization anymore, they say public-private partnerships. This government was voted out of office and replaced with a center-left coalition that was promising not to do these things. So 4 days after the tsunami hit, hundreds of thousands of people are displaced, 40,000 people have been killed, the dead aren't even buried yet, and the government is pushing through a water privatization bill. So that's happening in the capital. That's happening in Colombo. The rest of the agenda is also being pushed through with renewed fervor. And I interviewed the top officials at the World Bank.
Describe any different from any other ideology? As you point out in the book, the New Deal emerged out of the crisis. I'm a big fan of the New Deal myself, but you'd also have to argue that they overreached and did things like try to pack the court acceptable. They did.
I think there was a base support behind that, behind the initial push.
Sure.
And I think that where the parallels deserve to be made is, looking at the Bolsheviks and the sort of desire for crisis and recognizing a crisis in capital as the opportunity to push through an agenda. Because I think the real difference with the New Deal is that was a vision for a mixed economy. A mix and match economy that was not fundamentalist. I think Keynesians are compromisers by their very nature. Where you see the parallels is with other fundamentalists. I think when I'm talking about the Milton Friedmans of the world, I'm talking about market fundamentalists who believe in a vision of society that looks wonderful in their mathematical models in the basement of the University of Chicago, but are one of these systems that actually need a monopoly on power in order to be realized, because it's all about balance, right? And any distortion, is polluting the possibility of this balance, this promise of the perfectly balanced market. That's true for religious fundamentalists. It's true for Marxist fanatics. It can't countenance any other ideology that sets off the balance. So it's those ideologies, I think, that are very dangerous in the moment of crisis, because they imagine the dislocation as a kind of a clean sheet, a blank slate, and a moment to build the ideal world. And I think the difference is that many of the other ideologies that have done this, whether it's the Taliban, or the Bolsheviks, have actually been held accountable for the crimes that have been required to build their model states. And what I'm trying